Thank you, Rabbi. I can't think of two better people to have this conversation with. I had the great fortune to work with Matt at the Treasury on disrupting terrorist financing, and so we're going to, talk about disrupting financing for anti-Semitism, and also, Johnny with his esteemed career at the Central Intelligence Agency. So I want to start with you, Matt, because Matt is one of the foremost experts on Hamas and truly wrote the textbook on Hamas before really anyone really knew about the threat of Hamas. And I joke with Matt that in grad school when I was studying terrorist financing, my bibliography is all Matthew Levitt. And so, Matt, just to start with you, when you look at the rise in these anti-Semitic incidents, and you think about the money that has been flowing, which sometimes isn't very much money, what do you make of the rise in the money that's fueling it on campus and inside organizations? We've heard from previous speakers about money coming in and outside of the United States, but maybe just level set for us where you see the financing threat today.
So first of all, congratulations to everybody for putting this on. Thank you for doing it. I feel like we got the lesser half of the couple. I kind of wish no one was here, but all right, we'll make do.
She's the much better half.
Oh yeah.
We'll make do. So look, I think the first thing to say is that I think you got to think of October 7th as like an MRI. You get an MRI and the doctor finds something, it's not like that's what caused it. It was pre-existing. October 7th has revealed, in sharp contrast, deep anti-Semitism that pre-existed and then just felt comfortable, released to be able to come out so quickly. It's not like this came out of nowhere. There had to be something that was pre-existing. And I think that, just to kind of piggyback on what Brooke was talking about, I really do think that whether it's some of the groups on the left, including groups affiliated with the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, which is a Marxist, not an Islamist group, or the groups in the United States that are Islamist and are more tied to Hamas, they have all seen very closely what we have done in civil and criminal cases both. I think in particular about the criminal case against the Holy Land Foundation for Relief and Development outside of Dallas. I worked that case when I was with the FBI. I was later the government's expert witness in that case. And
that's a hard case to prosecute.
It's a whole story. But the bottom line is, it's like playing poker with an open hand. Like if you showed these people actually how far they can go, and they went exactly that far in setting up organizations that then post-October 7th were able to deploy on campuses and other places. And I think that, just to give another example of a civil case, the case of the Boyne family in Chicago against the Quranic Literacy Institute and the Islamic Association for Palestine and the HLF bankrupted those organizations. But now other organizations, American Muslims for Palestine, Students for Justice in Palestine, came out of those, some of the same people doing some of the same things, but going just up to the legal line, and they put these things in motion. So what you're going to see now is both, I can tell you, the FBI is pursuing all kinds of criminal cases, both for support organizations here and for anybody here or abroad who was tied to the events of October 7th itself or were in Hamas leadership positions. And then there also are, I'm involved in a bunch of them, a whole bunch of civil cases that are percolating, some have already been filed, to hold people and organizations responsible, including some here, who have ties to Hamas. And that's important because there's legislation that makes that illegal. There's not legislation that makes it illegal to say nasty things. So we have to be kind of proactive in how we go about this.
So I'm going to volley to Johnny for a second, and then I'm going to come back to you. But when you were the speechwriter to the director of the CIA, the deputy director, you dealt with very sensitive issues following just the terrorist attacks of October 7th. We need to continue to call it terrorist attacks of October 7th and not forget that. when writing, because you've written about many events after terrorism, during terrorism, how do you separate the personal and the professional when you're about to go and write those remarks?
I'll give you the lab room, the sort of the laboratory answer, which is I do a very poor job because I'm a pretty emotional guy. And so, I'll speak from personal experience in that I think we all remember October 7th. I think the news kept coming in, and every time, every wave of information, it was horrifying. And then you saw the domestic reaction here from groups like DSA, Democratic Socialists of America. And you thought it was parody. And I remember being filled with rage, being filled with sorrow. And if I were writing, and I've done some writing of my own, you let that channel through because that's authentic. But when you're writing at a place like the agency, if you're an analyst or a speechwriter, if you're writing for the government, or frankly, in the private sector, if you're writing for an institution, you have to remember that you're capturing a voice. You're not capturing your own voice, you're capturing the institutional voice. And so it's simple tricks like having really good teammates who can look at something before it goes out. It's sleeping on it. How many of us have written something that before we went to bed thought was the most amazing thing in the world, and then you wake up and you realize it's terrible? Never. So that's really, it's hard. Now, part of why I enjoy being out of government is that I can express my own personal voice and the anger, the fury, the sorrow of that day, but it's impossible. It's very difficult.
Well, the reason why I ask you the question is because words matter. And words from campuses matter, from major institutions, from key leaders, and it's not just our elected officials anymore. When you're a major institution in the community or in the country, when an event occurs, your words matter. And so do you think that there is enough appreciation, or is there a dismissive nature for why some words are used, like calling it terrorism or not, and calling it a heinous attack or not, compared to other barbaric events that have occurred in this country? What does that look like in the editing process? Because I think a lot of people in this room following October 7th were extremely angry because the Jewish community has always come to the defense of many groups. Very charitable, very philanthropic. But when it came to the Jewish people on the most heinous of days, those words weren't used.
You put it well. It's infuriating. I think, though, what matters is recognizing which audience you're speaking to or what the mission of the organization is. So if you're involved as a government in, I think we had talked earlier about this, negotiations, let's say. What's important is, as much as you want to say something, let's say with negotiations, the most important thing is doing no harm. It's Hippocratic in that way. The idea that whatever's being said in a negotiating room, your messaging, as much as you want to call it something, your messaging can't contradict what's going on in that room. And so there's a defensive element. There's almost the danger of words is saying the wrong thing. And then in the world that we live in social media, being replayed and replayed and replayed. That said, there's a positive message or a positive force in your words, which is that whatever going on behind the scenes, you can reinforce the red lines that you're saying. You can reinforce the messages that you're conveying. So it's delicate. The editing process, I'm a narcissist. I love all the words I write. I don't like being edited. But it's very, very difficult.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I think we've learned a lot about the editing process in institutions and why words are used. But Matt, going back to you, so when you think about the rise in the anti-Semitic incidents and the money that's behind it, unfortunately, the hatred is quite bipartisan. It's quite on both sides because you've got groups that are radical on both sides that are funding these issues. How do you separate out following this money that's fueling anti-Semitism versus terrorism? Do you see similarities? Do you see differences? You are an expert on this. You know where it comes from, where it doesn't come from, what's reality. Give us some candid nature.
First, I just have to add one comment on why being edited is so important, and punctuation in particular. The first article I wrote after October 7th was in Foreign Affairs. It was entitled "The War Hamas Always Wanted." And I used that, it's nice, it's pithy, it's for a lot of the lectures I did on Hamas afterwards. And one place ran a flyer with no punctuation that just said, "The War Hamas Always Wanted" with Matthew Levitt. I'm here to tell the tale.
Could have used the
but
comma there, right?
Yeah, could have used the comma. Look, when it comes to international terrorism, we have the Material Support Statute. We have some very powerful laws at our disposal. When it comes to domestic terrorism, which includes both far right and far left, we don't have a domestic equivalent. And the Supreme Court, when it upheld the Material Support Statute, was very clear that in our Constitution, there could never be a similar law for domestic violent extremist groups. Now, there are all kinds of other ways to deal with that, but it does mean, I think, that there's a much bigger role for civil society. So, first of all, there's a role for civil cases, and these have been very, very successful in this space. Brooke's done many of them. I mentioned a couple more. But there's also an element of just kind of shining a bright disinfectant light and naming and shaming. And there are a lot of people who are very quick to finance things because they think they can do it behind closed doors. And the ability to make people feel publicly accountable, whether it's people who are financing bad things or schools that are doing ridiculous things to their Jewish students, that can be very, very effective. Like you and I did this at the Treasury Department. Yeah. There's an element to naming and shaming bad banks that were doing things. We didn't even have to sanction them. They knew that they could be—
Just the threat.
Just the threat of being, not even of being sanctioned, but the threat of being on the front pages of the Wall Street Journal.
Because the greatest thing that people are most worried about is embarrassment.
Reputation is something worth protecting and investing in. People will put a lot of money behind their reputations.
So when you look at what's transpired since October 7th and what the policies have been, what haven't we done right? What future actions do you think?
How much time do we have? Look, there's a lot of things that we could discuss here, but just for the purpose of this panel, I think it's going to be really, really important for us to look in the rearview mirror, not only at what's happening right now, but look in the rearview mirror at what's happened in the past 10 to 15 years, since in particular those two cases I mentioned earlier, and look at some of the groups that have come out of that. And not only the ones on the Islamist Hamas side, of which there are several, but groups like Samidun, which is more active in Europe than it is here, but is tied to the PFLP, to the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, and is very plugged into that socialist milieu in this country. We have had a small number of people who were affiliated with the PFLP who became major activists in the Me Too and the Black Lives Matter movement. Those are legitimate movements, right? But you had people who came up in this space. One person ultimately had her citizenship stripped and was deported to Jordan because she never mentioned when she became a citizen that she was involved in the killing of an American in Jerusalem in the 1980s for the PFLP. It's not always going to be quite that simple. And we're going to need to look very closely at these organizations that have been financing these activities on our campus for some time. And I think we clearly need to start with SJP, Students for Justice in Palestine, and with American Muslims for Palestine. And I'll just say, in closing on this, it's not all going to be, I'm coming out in Washington, D.C. It's not all going to be Washington, D.C. efforts. I've been in talks with state attorneys general across the country who are working at the state level with other state institutions that have tremendous oversight, for example, over state universities. Won't necessarily work with the private schools, but at state universities, tremendous influence and financial purse string influence. And there's all kinds of ways to work in creative ways to take a close look at what's happening and make big changes fast.
So, Jonathan, to go back to the messaging of this, because the campaign to counter this, the messaging is incredibly important. So in messaging against anti-Semitism, what do we need to do better And what would be your recommendation?
I mean, first off, I think the community has done a very good job. After October 7th, I think the consistent focus on the hostages, on the attack, has been both, passionate and authentic. It's been consistent, and that's been important because people should not lose sight of that. I see the dog tags, I see the yellow ribbons, and that's crucial. But that success means that we still need to stay on top of our messaging and sort of avoid the own goals, if you will. And we talked about this, but what happened at the Oscars helps illustrate that point. You had this director. He got up there. I think we all heard what he said. He said that he refuted his Jewishness and the Holocaust being used to hijack, or being hijacked by the occupation, I think was the exact phrase. And what he said was horrific, and we'll get to that in a second. But what ended up happening is, I think, in the nature of the times we live in, that quote was cut short by many advocates. And it became a discussion about whether or not that director had refuted his Judaism. And it gave them an easy way out. And we'll attack the words that he said, because what had happened then is that the narrative shifted to, well, what did he say? Are both sides engaging in good faith in this conversation? And what I'll tell you is that the words he said, what he actually said, they were thoughtless, they were offensive, particularly after 10/7, because it had nothing to do with the occupation. And it had everything to do with the elimination of the Jewish people and of the Jewish state. You look at sort of where Hamas attacked. That territory has been part of Israel since 47, since 48. You look at the communities that Hamas attacked, that were pro-peace and had embraced the Palestinian people. And so the only way that this is about occupation is if occupation refers to the entire state of Israel. And if that's the case, then that really highlights what they want. And you wouldn't see so many references to 1948 in the posters at these rallies otherwise. But this is the discussion we need to be having, not about what words were actually said, but the meaning of the words that were said. And we gave them an easy way out in this. Now, the only other thing I would say is, I think there needs to be a next frontier in where this messaging goes. We've done a really good job of defining anti-Semitism. We talked about admiring the problem. I think we've done a good job of attacking it. The next step is taking on anti-Zionism. That is a phrase that needs to be sharpened, because right now it becomes a cloak for anti-Semites and others to say, well, I'm not anti-Semitic, I'm just anti-Zionist. So the next step is defining that term. And I think for now, make it limited. Do you believe that the state of Israel has the right to exist? And if your answer is no, you're either willfully ignorant of the history of the Jewish people and what destroying the state would mean, getting rid of the state would mean, or you're gleeful about it. So that to me is the next step. The next frontier is not just defining anti-Semitism as we have, but sharpening anti-Zionism and making it the toxic term that it needs to be.
Well said. So to wrap up, Matt, and we'll take a question or two. When you look at the cancer that is going into the constant funding in the United States, and given the limitations that we have in our own federal legal system, which has been the same limitations since 9/11, I used to always think that it would take a horrendous event like 9/11 for the Patriot Act to be passed, and then it would shake things up. But it took a horrible event. I can't think of anything worse than October 7th. We've both studied terrorism. We've both seen what ISIS and others have done, and we've both watched the footage. And rape and human trafficking there's nothing to compare to terrorism. It's worse than terrorism. And so what needs to occur to shake up the legal landscape, do you think, for domestically for us to be able to go after this funding more effectively?
So there are two answers to this. The first is, I am not waiting for government to act. No one who's here is waiting for government to act. And there's a lot that can be done from a civil society perspective with civil cases working with state governments that can really move this ball forward in the moment. As someone who comes from Washington, Washington's broken. I don't care which party you're interested in. Right now, Washington is kind of broken. Congress is really broken. I'm not waiting for them to act. It's just too pressing. Yep. That said, I'm one of a large number of people who's been advocating for a long time before October 7th for authorities to broaden out as they think about counterterrorism, in particular as they're thinking about extremism and domestic extremism, which doesn't have the benefit of these foreign terrorist laws, to be thinking about the use of hate crime legislation. Now, our hate crime legislation isn't as broad as, say, Canada's, where I think we will soon be hearing about people being charged under hate crimes for river to the sea, all that kind of stuff, by any means necessary. We wouldn't have that extent of the law here with our protections, but there are clear federal and often clearer still even state-level hate crime legislation that can be used to great benefit. And we need to be really aggressive in that. But at the end of the day, I think that we need to be, and again, there are already lots of groups doing this, pursuing civil litigation, proactively putting out the messaging that you've been talking about. You know, I think it's really important to remind people day in and day out that the not just anti-Israel, not just anti-Zionism, but the expressly anti-Semitic activities, accosting people as they came out of synagogue on Saturday mornings and calling them murderers and people committing genocide, that predated the IDF going into Gaza to try and dislodge the Hamas government and rescue the hostages. So we have a lot of work we can do without waiting for government, but I do think there are things that can happen.
Well, I want to thank you, Matt, because, you know, he has brought what Hamas has done prior to October 7th and post-October 7th to light. And so without you and, you know, what your work you're doing at the Washington Institute and continue to do, I don't think we would be as educated about the threat of Hamas.
Go on.
So
It's like meeting my heroes. Yeah.
So I highly recommend, because what Matt is doing from a civil society perspective is educating us about the true threat that Hamas has been posing for many, many years. So Jonathan, just to close, you at PROSEC advise, you know, the top brass in our private sector on their messaging. What role do you think the private sector, and to Matt's point, outside of government, needs to take from a messaging perspective to counter this threat moving forward and to confront it head on?
I mean, I probably should have teed this up that I'm speaking on my own behalf and not on my company. I always need to preface it with that. But no, look, the most important thing, well, two most important things when it comes to messaging as I see it. One, that it's authentic, because we can see through phonies. I mean, we're going to have panels later on social media and the wisdom of the crowds. I know we like to criticize social media, and it can sometimes be a terrible place, but on the whole, the wisdom of the crowds in determining what is authentic versus what isn't. So being authentic is, I think, key. But two, if you're in a position in the private sector where you are passionate about this, and this is an issue that matters to you, pursue it. Don't shy away. Because the months will only go farther away from 10/7, and people will forget, and they'll try to forget. But if this is passionate to you and it's authentic, embrace it. Because otherwise, I think you're missing an opportunity to make a difference.
Jonathan, Matthew, thank you so much.